Welcome everybody, buonasera a tutti e benvenuti all'Istituto Italiano di Cultura. The conversation of tonight is the first of a series dedicated to exile and creativity. What does this mean? Is about the Italian people who had to left Italy between the First and the Second World War, and came here for political reason of the racial laws in Italy, and how this migration changed not only their personal life of careers, but also the cultural scene in Italy and in the US, and sometimes not only the cultural scene. This is the first one. The second will be next month, and it will be a conversation about Toscanini with James Conlon, a well-known conductor and herbe sax. And the month after, we will have a discussion about Italian politicians who came here, and in May we have a concert dedicated to the music of Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, who was one of the Jews forced to leave Italy. I decided to start with Enrico Fermi, not only because Enrico Fermi is one of the most outstanding Italian who came, but also because some months ago I received the galleys of a beautiful book about Enrico Fermi, written by David Schwartz, and I want to show you also because tonight, for a series of different reasons, we are not books here, and so I hope that you can buy on the internet of bookstores. And I assure you that it's very, very good. Also because, as you can see, English is not my language and physics is not my cup of tea, but I understood everything. The English and the physics in this book. So this series is made in collaboration with Renato Camurri, a professor of contemporary history in Italy, and with Primo Levi Center, and I welcome Alessandro Cassin, who is with us tonight. The discussion about Enrico Fermi and the book is moderated by Mario Calvo Platero, who is not only a well-known journalist, but also a friend of mine, and for me it's more important that he's a friend, and with David Schwartz, obviously, the author of the book, and with William Allen Zeitz, who is a Rebbe professor of physics at Columbia University, one of the teaching position more important in the world of physics, and also a place where Enrico Fermi worked when he arrived here in New York and in the US. So please enjoy.
Well, thank you very much, Giorgio. So here we are. I'm going to quickly pass the mic around. Some of you may wonder, well, as Giorgio may not be so familiar with physics, what am I doing here? Being, I'm not certainly an expert of physics, but I have known David for a while, and he was telling me, even when he was working on this, how fascinating the story of Fermi was, and not just his research, but his life and how he ended up coming here. There is a life story that I think it's worth really reading, and there are so many things with that are attached to this, and with the idea that Giorgio had of exile and creativity, which then will bring us later on also to something that it's in a way very, very contemporary, because in Italy there is a lot of talk about brain drain, and is it good, is it bad, does it help, and so on and so forth. So I'd like later on to also address that issue. We have Bill Zykes, of course, that will probably trying to put things into perspective so that even people like me will understand the dynamics of certain aspects of physics. And I really would like to start our conversation with David telling us about the early years of Enrico Fermi. We know Enrico Fermi as a legend, but what was the atmosphere in Italy when he came to age as a physicist?
Thank you, Mario. Well, I think the first thing to say is that it was recognized very early that Enrico Fermi was a prodigy.
Excuse me, I interrupt you immediately. As the moderator, I have full power of the... So one thing I failed to disclose, which I think is extremely interesting, is that David Schwartz is the son of Melvin Schwartz. Melvin Schwartz was the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1988, and he developed a new theory, starting to work from the theory of Enrico Fermi. So one other aspect is that Fermi has been sort of a presence in your home, you were telling me once. Yes. So, sorry, I hope I'm not going to make too many interruptions.
No, it's okay. Interrupt away. That's great. Yes, that's correct. But I think the first thing I wanted to say is that, when Fermi was very young, he was recognized as a prodigy. And we're going to, there's a lot to go into about his early life. He was very, very close to his older brother, who died at the age of 14 or 15. They did everything together. They built electric motors together. They did all sorts of physics experiments together as kids. And it's often, it's sort of very sad. He died, Giulio was his brother, and died during surgery for an abscess in his throat. And it's interesting to speculate what would have happened had he lived, because the two of them, it's hard to imagine, but people thought that Giulio was as smart, if not smarter, than Enrico. So it's hard to imagine what the two of them might have done together. But Enrico found another friend who was also very bright, perhaps not as bright as Giulio, named Enrico Persico, who became a lifelong friend and a colleague of his. And the two of them began to really teach, Fermi began to teach Enrico Persico physics. Persico was basically his first student. But I think two things that are important about this early period in his life from the point of view of his development as a physicist were, number one, he was recognized as a prodigy by a colleague of his father's who was an engineer and who decided to take young Enrico under his wing to teach Enrico as much as he could learn about mathematics and physics. Now, what that meant in practice with Enrico Fermi was that by the time he was 18 years old, he understood everything there was to know about classical physics. I'll repeat that because it's useful to think about it. He understood everything there was to know about classical physics by the time he was 18. By the time he got to university, there was nothing that the professors at University of Pisa or the Scuola Normale could teach him about physics, because they didn't know anything about quantum theory or relativity theory, which gets to a point that Mario and I have discussed and Bill and I have discussed, which is that Italy at that particular moment was a backwater of physics. The professors of physics throughout Italy had not really followed the quantum revolution, had not really followed Einstein's theories. In fact, they were resistant to it. And all of a sudden, there was this young guy who arrives in Pisa and decides to teach himself all there was to know about quantum theory and relativity. By the time he got out of university, 4 years later, he had in fact done that quite successfully. He was a well-known lecturer on relativity and on quantum theory by the time he left the University of Pisa. He was also, at this time, adopted by a group of Italian mathematicians who were the best in the field. Italian physics may not have been very good, but Italian mathematics was really, really cutting edge. Italian mathematicians taught Einstein a lot of the mathematics that he needed to know in order to do the theory of relativity. And so they brought him into a salon that took place every Saturday afternoon in Rome, and introduced him to the world of Italian mathematics, and were his first real sponsors as a young man and as a young prodigy. And they understood that he was every bit as good in physics as they were in mathematics, and his reputation spread through that salon.
And that salon was very important for him because it is there, it is in the salon that he met.
Oh, well, he met his wife.
His bride-to-be, exactly. So that is,
so it was a personal.
We want also the romance.
That's right,
besides
absolutely.
the mathematics.
So the people who attended the salon were obviously intellectuals, but also people who were well placed within the Jewish community in Rome, because many of these people were Jewish, and one of them happened to be an admiral in the Italian Navy named Capone, Admiral Capone. Now, his daughter came along. They all brought their kids along with them. And his daughter was Laura Capone, who began to have an interest in Enrico, and Enrico began to have an interest in her. And it took a little while, but in 1928 they got married.
And then the rest of history, because Enrico Fermi in the end came to the United States because his wife, being Jewish, fell under the racial laws in 1938, and so that's how they came here. So if we can now move forward a bit, and Bill, hear from you, what was, we saw how he came to age, how he became a physics. So what happened? What did he do? If you can explain to us, generalist. I know, of course, Bill is a scientist, so
he's also a teacher.
He's also a teacher, but he teaches people that are the much higher level than me and not David. No, I mean, he's the son of a Nobel Prize in physics. So, the floor is yours.
So I couldn't think of anything more intimidating than asking a physicist to explain what Enrico Fermi did. And Enrico Fermi's collected papers are 2 volumes that stacked are about this high, and his work touched nearly every aspect of physics, but not in a way that became something that is popular knowledge, the way people understand Einstein did something, or perhaps people understand Werner Heisenberg did something, or Niels Bohr in quantum mechanics. Fermi's contributions, in reality, are the underpinnings of everything we do in the world today. For better or worse, cell phones would not be possible without Fermi's contributions, something that's called Fermi-Dirac statistics, which represented a key advance in understanding how matter organizes itself, and is the basis for the semiconductor industry, which in turn is the basis for all of the advances in computing and in technology that we associate with computation, the internet, and so on. Fermi is also the first person who created a sustained release of nuclear energy. He invented, in a very real sense, the nuclear reactor. Now, nuclear reactors and nuclear power have a somewhat variegated view in the public eye, but nonetheless, this was an enormous contribution to our ability to obtain, in principle, inexpensive, in principle, clean energy. I'm seeing someone waving their hand back there.
Maybe the microphone, hold on. Try like that.
Thank you. And that work was done as part of the Manhattan Project and was an essential aspect of the project that led to the availability of plutonium, which was the explosive material, not the first, but in the second bomb that was exploded in Japan, and is now the basis, again, I think in this case we would say for worse rather than better, but nonetheless is the basis for all nuclear weaponry. But Fermi did much more than that. He organized the way we think about nature and the way in which we look for new advances in our understanding about elementary particles, which in turn have everything to do with how we understand things such as the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang. How did he do that? This is what he viewed as his greatest contribution to physics, and that was a contribution that, in the end, the next major advance was made by the experiment that David's father did in conjunction with two other colleagues at Columbia. So Fermi wrote down a description of the so-called weak decay. This is not something terribly exciting, and it's actually rather hard to explain, to give an example of. It's true that the glow of radium that you see in a dark room is due to the weak decay. But because it's in somewhat of an obscure corner, it's not something we can point to like nuclear fission, where there's an example of that's the case of where the strong interaction is at play. But nonetheless, the weak decay is an essential organizing property of how we view the world of elementary particles and the so-called standard model of elementary particles. And Fermi's description and writing down a mathematical theory of the weak decay was an absolutely key step in that. And accordingly, the constant that appears in that is now referred to as the Fermi constant. I could go on, I won't, but there's really such a broad array of Fermi contributions throughout physics. As I was just sat down here and was thinking about how I might give you some sense of that. So I already mentioned Fermi direct statistics. There's only two types in one classification of elementary particles. They're either bosons, named after a physicist Bose, or they're fermions, named after Fermi, of course. So there's Fermi direct statistics. There's fermions. There's the Fermi constant that I mentioned. There's the Fermi interaction. There's Fermi Lab, a national laboratory in Illinois. The unit of distance that we use to describe the size of nuclei is a Fermi. A Fermi is a thousandth of a trillionth of a meter, which sounds microscopic. It's submicroscopic, but it's very handy. All nuclei are sort of somewhere between 1 Fermi and 7 or 8 Fermis in size. And so a colleague was telling me once that, so Fermi is written, you would say the size of a lead nucleus has a radius of 7, then abbreviation FM. But it works out that FM is also a femtometer, 10 to the minus 15 meters. And a colleague once told me that he had an instructor who always insisted on calling it a femtometer rather than a Fermi. Why was that? Because so much stuff is named after Fermi. He doesn't need one more damn thing. Now, as I was thinking that, the person who told me that story walked into the room. That's Mike Tannenbaum over there. And so Mike, who told you that? I.I. Robbie. Okay, thank you.
Well, let me ask you briefly a question, and then I think that David also has a question for you. This is a provocative question. It comes from a journalist, of course. But people have been saying that Fermi has been underestimated vis-a-vis Einstein. That, Einstein is the iconic symbol that we have of the ultimate giant in the world of physics. And some people say, well, actually, Fermi is right there, if not even above, but is not quite recognized. What would you say? I know it's hard to judge, the iconic predecessors of yours, but what is your opinion on that?
This is like comparing Mozart to Rodin. It doesn't work. Fermi was unique among the pantheon of superb physicists in that he was both an excellent theoretical physicist like Einstein and a superb experimental physicist. And no one since Fermi, and actually no one before Fermi, ever combined those two aspects with such virtuosity. And in fact, that, in some sense, that's the sense of the title of David's book. But I would make the following distinction is, and David and I had this discussion, and he might want to add on, because in one of the nice reviews of his book, Fermi was relegated in the beginning of the review to sort of a second tier or even lower status, and we were both very surprised by that. So I spent some time thinking about it, and
so it was a good question after all, too.
Oh, yeah, it's a wonderful question. I mean, I would say there are two people who changed our worldview profoundly, absolutely profoundly. One was Einstein. The other was Niels Bohr, and one might add in conjunction with Werner Heisenberg. So those are the sorts of contributions that are unique to them, and you would not attribute to Fermi. But Fermi's was just superb in a way that I honestly think is unparalleled, with the possible exception of Newton, in the ability to both perform experiments and fundamental theory. Mm-hmm. That's the sense in which Fermi is absolutely unique, and I think it's the basis for the reverence that physicists have for Fermi.
Thank you, David.
Bill, if you could, one of the things that struck me about in writing the book, and this gets the issue of creativity a bit, it doesn't get to Exile yet, but it gets to creativity, is Fermi's ability to continue to produce throughout his life. I mean, many physicists, many great physicists, have a moment early on in their career where they do their greatest thing, and then, I wouldn't say they coast, but they're never able to, they lose momentum in some way. And Fermi is, Harriet Zuckerman was a sociologist of science who's pointed out that Fermi continued to publish and publish and publish and do new work throughout his whole life, until the age of 53 when he died. And that's why there's this stack of, when you look at his papers, there are 250 odd papers of his that are about a third of which are major, major papers, many of which occurred after the war. He invented, well, he didn't invent computational physics, but he did the first real simulations of chaotic systems in a computer. He just did so much later in life. Can you sort of talk, Bill, about why you think he was able to do that for so long? So his creativity was sustained for so long.
Sorry, I have to add one thing to the creativity issue, because it's within the title of our series here. But when we were chatting before, and Bill also had a comment on the creativity of Enrico, so you can summarize them together.
Okay. I had time to think about the second question, but not the first one, David. So that one caught me by surprise. Thank you. No, it's a superb question and observation. I would say that Fermi was able to maintain his production. I'm not sure I would call it creativity in the later phase of his life, because he had built up such an enormous, broad legacy of topics on which he could work, and there were so many that became available to him after the end of the war, such as computation that you mentioned. That really is the founding paper of the numerical study of chaotic behavior in systems. But most of his results that were published after the war, not all of them, were typically experimental papers, and I'm an experimental physicist. My theoretical colleagues tell us that that doesn't require much creativity. I'll come back to that. And then he did some theoretical work with Chandrasekhar, for instance. But the really seminal, sharp insights into nature were done as a younger man. So I think you can see this behavior in some sense of doing mostly theoretical physics in the early part of his career, transitioning to experimental physics, but retaining the ability to work in both and to freely, whatever topic became of interest to him, whether or not it was the fashionable topic in the field, he had the toolbox that he could address it, whether it required an experiment or whether it required some theoretical approach. Now, as to the aspect of creativity, so we were having a very nice discussion about this when we arrived here, and if you asked most physicists to name the amazing attributes of Fermi, I don't think creativity would be in the top 3 attributes of Fermi. It would be this unparalleled ability to work in both in theoretical and experimental physics. Probably the first descriptor that would be deployed is the simplicity of his approach to physics. So if there was, the way in which we envision his creativity or describe it is creativity through simplicity. And there's almost any competent physicist can follow almost any Fermi paper. That's not true for vast fields of physics, but it's true for the papers that Fermi wrote, and it's due to his approach to physics. And David gave you a hint in his very first remarks about Fermi, about his need to teach. And so what did he do? Following the death of his brother, he became, in effect, the teacher of Enrico Persico. And that is the way in which Fermi organized his thoughts. How simple can I make this, this calculation? What's the bare minimum I need to bring into this particular attempt to understand nature? And then how can I make it sufficiently simple I can teach it to a student? And now, Fermi was famed for this, and that to a physicist, that is a beautiful aspect, to see some topic that's potentially complicated explained very simply. And from what I read about Fermi's former students, they would go to his lectures, and whether or not it was a student or sometimes a more senior physicist, and they would be so struck, oh, I never understood that, now I get it. I should have thought of that myself. And then they would go away and try to recreate it and realize, oh, well, maybe I need to go back and ask Enrico exactly how that worked. But eventually, I mean, he was a superb mentor of very, very prominent scientists, many of whom went on to win the Nobel Prize. So it's clear he was able not only to make them understand it perhaps the first time, but to make them absorb it in the same way that it became part of Fermi's DNA.
Thank you, Bill. Now, David, tell us about the exile of Fermi. So what happened? I think his father, the father of his wife-to-be was an admiral, no? Was he a fascist at the beginning? So how it happened and how did he arrive into America?
That's an interesting story. The story actually begins in 1930 when Fermi and his family came to the United States for a summer session in Ann Arbor. He had a couple of friends who were at the University of Michigan who organized annual summer sessions there. And Laura hated the United States, absolutely hated the experience. She hated New York. It was too noisy. It was too dirty. She hated the Midwest. It was too boorish. The only saving grace was that there were a number of Europeans at the Ann Arbor summer session that she spent a lot of time with. Fermi, on the other hand, loved the United States, loved the freedom, the flexibility, the lack of hierarchy, the lack of tradition, and thought it was liberating. And he wanted to come back from day one. They came back to Rome, and every other year from that point on, Fermi spent the summer in the United States. But Laura refused to come back. She just didn't like it. And so she would spend the summer in her Tuscan villa, which had been given to her and her siblings, her cousins, by her uncle, aunt and uncle. And And so during this entire period, Enrico wanted to come to the United States and Laura didn't. Toward 1937 and 1938, matters became worse, both for Enrico and for Laura. For Enrico, and this is a point that I make in the book, and it's often easy to forget, Italy was becoming isolated within the international community. They had just been through the fascist invasion of Ethiopia. Italy was isolated within the UN and within the League of Nations, and found itself thrust into the arms of Nazi Germany, who was its only ally by the time 1937 came around. And what this meant was that scientists, the international scientists that Fermi relied upon to have dialogues with and conversations with, were reluctant to come to Rome anymore. That was already the case in 1927, when the first great conference was held at Lake Como. And then there was a conference in Rome in 1931, and already at that point, people like Einstein were saying, I'm not traveling to fascist Italy. This is not right for me. And it only got worse. So by 1937-38, Fermi was facing scientific isolation. He could travel anywhere he wanted to, and he did, but it wasn't good. And then in the middle of 1938, under pressure from Hitler, Mussolini passed a series of racial laws that affected the Jewish population in Italy. It began in the summer of 38 and extended over a series of edicts through the fall of 1938. And finally, Laura decided that the time had come for her to leave. It was a very reluctant decision on her part, but she realized that it was probably not going to work for her to stay. Now, her father, as you mentioned, was an Italian admiral and was actually a supporter of the fascist regime and was well thought of by the fascist government. And this was something that an Italian scholar named Mauro Canali told me when my wife and I were in Rome doing research. And he's a real scholar of the fascist period, particularly of the secret police under Mussolini. But he told me that the laws allowed for important Jewish families to apply for exemption from the laws. It seems bizarre, but you could apply to the Ministry of the Interior for exemption from the racial laws. And in fact, after Laura left in January of 39, the admiral applied for the whole family and got exemption from the racial laws. That didn't help him because in 1943, Mussolini fell and the Nazis took direct control over Rome and collected as many Jews as they could and sent them off to Auschwitz, one of them being Laura's father. And so he died there. Fermi, during the period of late 1938, when they had already decided to leave, Fermi was approached in a cocktail party in Copenhagen by Bohr. And Bohr said, would you be prepared to accept, would you be able to accept the Nobel Prize if it were offered to you? Now, this had never been done before, and as far as I know, hasn't been done since. But it was done because everyone knew that German scientists were no longer allowed to accept Nobel Prizes, and the question was whether Mussolini would have the same view. Fermi knew enough about what was going on in Italy to assure Bohr that if it was offered to him, he would accept it. He came home to Rome, and Laura and Enrico decided they would use the Nobel Prize ceremony in Stockholm as a way to get out of Italy, which is exactly what they did. They, in the process of getting out, Enrico needed a place to come to, and he and his wife, knowing that they were under surveillance by the secret police, they had been since 1932, I think, or 31, went up into the mountains behind the Tuscany villa and dropped letters to 5, I think, American universities saying, is there a place for me there? And he got a letter back from P. Graham, who was not only the chair of the physics department, but also the dean of the college at Columbia, and saying, yes, we'd love to have you, because he had taught there in 36 and had been offered a job then and there on the spot by Pigram. So he came to the United States via Stockholm with his family, and they settled here in New York, where he did the first, where almost immediately he began to do work on what became the Manhattan Project. So it was a self-exile. It was done. He was the most important scientist in fascist Italy. He was lionized by the fascist government. He was one of the charter members of the, I hope I'll pronounce this right, the Reale Accademia d'Italia, which was Academia. Okay, sorry. And he was one of the charter members at a very young, the youngest member, and was famous in Italy. So this was a real blow to the fascist regime, his departure. He said to them that he was only going for 6 months, but they soon figured out that that wasn't quite true.
Thank you. And so Exile and creativity, back to that, and then here in America, I gather he found his connection. And this brings us to the more general subject that I started to introduce before, because we have in Italy lots of discussions and conversation about the brain drain, you know, the so-called fuga dei cervelli, and there is a whole, you know, there is a whole school of thought that says, you know, this is awful that you know, we form very good students and then all of a sudden they leave the country and they go to America and they stay there, and so that is very bad. And there is another theory, which is instead that this is great because science needs communication and needs, you know, and these young people need to have the possibility of doing whatever they can at their best. So this is, you know, a connecting point, and I personally think that there is no brain drain, that, you know, that great minds do and go wherever they need to go and whatever they can do. And Prime Minister Renzi was in California once when he was Prime Minister and addressed the subject and said, you know, we're very happy to see that we have so many young kids here in the West Coast, in Silicon Valley, doing what they can do here because it's good for Italy. And so in a way there is a connection, you know, back then was an exile, was forced, today is not forced, but here we are, you know, talking about Fermi at the Italian Cultural Institute, thanks to the creativity of our director. And there is another point of contact, that is Carlo Rubbia. Carlo Rubbia is Nobel Prize for Physics in 1984, and he is, you know, he came back to Chicago to work at the Fermi Lab with the idea of bringing an accelerator. And there is a whole connection between CERN and between the lab in the Gran Sasso, which Rubbia has funded, and now the Fermi Lab in Chicago that started, I think, the construction of this accelerator. So can we address this subject? I mean, we talk here, you know, that some people in the administration, you know, that this administration wants to put a stop to visas and companies are complaining. So it's in both directions. You know, on the one hand, Italy complains for the brain drain, and here people say, well, we don't want people to come here and take the job of other people. So you are a scientist. Yeah, but it's still debated, so it's...
Yes, you were starting to say I'm a scientist and not a politician, so I can only give you some science-based thoughts on this. I think only the most reactionary elements of the American public are saying that we don't want the best scientific talent to come to the United States. And yes, they might take jobs that some people would say should have been an American job, but in reality, in the United States, we're not necessarily producing the number and caliber of people at the very top in many academic disciplines as the rest of the world. We can't, by just the simple nature of the statistics. So we're more than happy to have such people come to places like Columbia and go through the academic system, which is grueling, admittedly. But one of my former graduate students has a position in Italy. He's an American, married to an Italian wife. And the description he provided to me of what it takes to be promoted to a senior scientist, where the examinations, there are examinations at every level, and it's public how you do on the exam, and you're competing against your colleagues. So that to me sounds even harder than the tenure system in elite US universities. That might be something that is a contributing factor. I can't speak to other things like the arts or the creativity of engineering and those sorts of things. But in academia, that's certainly something I would be thinking hard about. And even, I mean, this doesn't sound as if it's changed at all from the process that David describes in his book, or how academic positions were awarded at Fermi's time, except maybe there was, well, I hesitate to say whether there was more or less graft and corruption in 1920 as opposed to 100 years later.
Thank you. And what is your thought on this? You know, is Italy, I mean, you went to Italy, you studied. Does Italy have some qualities, some points of excellence that could attract scientists over there, you know, like the Gran Sasso and particularly Rubbia has been very, very active in that. So a few words about also him. And
absolutely. You know, it used to be that the center of particle physics was at a lab 30 miles west of Chicago, Fermi Lab. And now the center of particle physics in the world is a lab outside of Geneva, Switzerland. It's a whole lot easier for Italians to get to commute back and forth to CERN than it is for them to commute back and forth to Fermi Lab. You know, and for a whole lot of reasons, some of them explicable, some of them very political and very idiosyncratic, the United States decided not to build the kind of accelerator that the Europeans built in the 1980s and 90s, and now all of that major work is being done there. I mean, there is some very important work being done here in the United States, and Bill, in fact, did some very important work out at Brookhaven not long ago. But the center is, you know, the center, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of physicists working at CERN. I think when I think on the brain drain, I think back to Fermi, and I think about his influence in Italian physics. You know, he may have left Italy in 1939 for good, but you know, he came back twice after the war for relatively short periods. But he left behind a huge legacy. The Rome school scattered during the war, but came back together after the war under the leadership of his great student, Edoardo Amaldi. And Amaldi became a centerpiece for European physics. So Italian physics became European physics in some sense. And you'd only have, it's not only Carlo Rubbia, it's Giannati, Fabiola Giannati, who is the Director General of CERN today. And you know, Italian physicists are extremely important on the continent. So I think, I'm not sure I worry about that brain drain so much, because Italian physics continues to be cutting edge, and not just at CERN, at Sasso, and at other places too, throughout Italy. It hasn't, the brain drain, as far as I can tell, hasn't depleted Italian physics in that way. Italian physics still is world class, and something, you know, which I think people really give Amaldi the credit for that, for continuing that after the war. Someone said to me, you must go visit Amaldi's home on Via Parioli, I think it is, in, I see, I'm getting there. And you must visit there, because that's the most important address of Italian physics. And I said, why? And he said, because Amaldi, during the war, took all the lab equipment that was at the University of Rome and stuck it in the basement of that apartment building. And he thereby saved hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment for after the war, which then they moved back to the campus and set up shop again. And it was an important thing. So Italian physics, I think, is not, it doesn't obviously, to me, show the results of any kind of particular brain drain.
Yeah, maybe we should have something changed in the university system and have it more flexible rather than, to attract back some of the scientists. But unfortunately, we have rigidities there. But I'd like to go back to the scientific aspect. And, one of the big contributions, the most important contribution for Fermi was the neutrino, that he called it with an Italian name, which is a link. I think your father got the Nobel Prize for transforming, and demonstrating the presence of the neutrino, and Carlo Rubbia is working on this project, Icarus, I would say, or Icarus, on the sterile neutrinos, and I was under the impression, but you may correct me, that they were trying to build a reactor by bringing things from Europe at the Fermi lab. But the question is, can you explain to us this line of this neutrino and how still today we are working on it and the discovery, and what is the new frontier? Where are we with the science today?
Okay, so yes, the neutrino is perhaps the most mysterious particle than in physics. The mysteries in physics that exist today are the dark energy that's causing the universe not only to expand, but to accelerate, to expand ever more quickly. Dark matter, of which we have no idea whatsoever, and the nature of the neutrino. So previously I mentioned the standard model. So that's something akin to the periodic table of elements for chemistry. There's a standard model that organizes the vast zoo of particles that we know about, including neutrinos. In a way, it's more mathematical than the periodic table of elements, but it systematizes our knowledge of the matter in the universe and the interactions between matter, the way light works, the way nuclei are held together. Gravity is standing somewhat outside the standard model, and one of the great efforts underway in physics is to unite standard model particle physics, in which quantum mechanics is dominant, with gravity. That's an ongoing task. But there's an aspect of the standard model that we don't understand whatsoever. It's that there are 3 types of neutrinos, but we don't understand the fact that they can transform into each other and that they have mass. We don't understand the nature of the mass that the neutrinos have. When I was in graduate school, we assumed neutrinos were massless. And Nobel Prizes have been awarded for showing that the different types of neutrinos can oscillate one into the other. So the first step in modern physics was the experiment that David's father conducted that showed that the neutrino wasn't a single type of particle. There were 2 types of neutrinos, one associated with electrons, the other one associated with a particle called the muon. That was an incredible experimental discovery. And now we know there's a 3rd neutrino, and on their journey through space, one of them can turn into an electron neutrino, can turn into a muon neutrino. But all of this really got its start with Fermi's writing down a very simple, very elegant expression that allowed us to understand how simple processes occur, like the decays inside a nucleus that take place in which a neutrino is emitted. or these take place at extraordinary rates in nuclear reactors, and some of the most potent sources of neutrino beams come from nuclear reactors or from the sun. So this is an effort underway, and it's an interesting story. I can't tell you whether it's going to be a complete success story. You earlier alluded to the fact that, and David also mentioned, that there were efforts to build the world's leading, most advanced, highest energy particle accelerator here in the United States. It was called the Superconducting Super Collider. It had super in there twice, just to tell you how important it was. And this was taking place in the 1980s, and it was underway, construction was underway, and it was terminated in the early years of the Clinton administration. And at that point, effectively, leadership in high energy physics transferred from the United States to CERN, Europe in general. CERN, this international consortium of nations that built a laboratory on the French-Swiss border near Geneva. And that has resulted in things perhaps you've heard about, like the discovery of the Higgs boson, which was an incredible adventure and tale in and of itself. So the U.S.'s strategy for recapturing leadership in high-energy particle physics is to focus on neutrinos. And so what will be done is to have a beam of neutrinos that begin at Fermilab in Chicago and make their way through the Earth. Neutrinos could pass through 1 million Earths undiminished, make their way underground to detectors that will be located in a laboratory, a new laboratory that's been built in South Dakota. And that should allow us to understand the parameters that characterize the oscillation of neutrinos from one, we call it one flavor, to another type, from electrons to muons and so on. Is that enough for the U.S. to recapture leadership in high-energy particle physics? I don't think so. Is it important? Absolutely. Is it a key physics question that we really need to have answered? Yes, indeed. But it raises very interesting questions which are completely unresolved in the sense that it's not clear what the second act is following the Higgs discovery at the laboratory at CERN. There may be a complete revolution in particle physics should they find evidence for some property, again with super, called supersymmetry. But people are becoming less optimistic about that. Well, what do? Can you build a bigger machine? There are talks of perhaps building an even larger accelerator, circular ring underground, than the one that's located at CERN in China, in Europe, not in the US. And the US is putting a great deal of its emphasis on the neutrino and this experiment that will be conducted at Fermilab.
There's, just to add, because Fermilab is unlike a number of labs in the United States, Fermilab conducts no classified research at all. So you can go and visit the neutrino campus at Fermilab, which Susan and I did in December, and stand in front of a neutrino beam, which doesn't hurt you at all, because you're being bathed by neutrinos every second from the sun.
So I have a last question for David before we open up the questions to the floor. I know that Giorgio probably would like to say something. Shall I make? Okay, so we'll make the question and then we open up. So really, the last question is: Laura didn't like to come in the U.S. Just to end, tell us about the family. How did they adapt? What was their family, how Fermi was a presence in your family, considering that the neutrino was so important for your father?
Well, let me start with Fermi's family, which is, you know, when they came to the United States, they had 2 small children, Giulio and Nella, and Fermi was not a particularly focused family man. He devoted all of his time to physics. And even when he wasn't doing physics, when on a weekend he would go out hiking or camping or mountain climbing or whatever, he was doing it with colleagues and students. He wasn't doing it with his kids. His kids definitely felt neglected throughout their childhood, and Nella talked about it openly in later years. Giulio never did. He changed his name to Judd, in part, we think, to actually distance himself from his Italian roots. And so he was not, Enrico was not the world's greatest father. And in fact, Laura, sort of didn't consider herself the world's greatest mother. The chapter about the kids in her book, Adams and the Family, which she published in '54, a lovely book about her married life. The chapter about the kids is how not to raise kids. And it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, but she really wasn't the world's greatest mother. She wasn't a particularly warm person. She wasn't a particularly maternal person. And for much of their lives, the Fermis had maids and housekeepers to help out around the house. So he wasn't the world's greatest family man. I don't think that Fermi certainly was a figure in our household in the sense that my father would say that, I'd say, "Daddy, what's a neutrino?" And he'd say, "Well, it's something that Enrico Fermi knew a lot about." But my father would never have thought of himself as, in the same category as Enrico Fermi. First of all, my father didn't do any real theory at all. I think he did one theory paper, and he just could. He once had. I asked him why he didn't like theory, and he said, I just knew that. He had a friend named Steve Weinberg, who was a very, very, very famous theorist. And he said, I sit there and look at what Steve does. I can't do that, but I love building things. I'm a great plumber and I'm a great electrician, and I love building things, so I love doing experiments. And he happened to be extremely good at doing that. And he was being very modest. It's not just plumbing. It's not just being an electrician. It's thinking deeply about the configuration of an experimental apparatus that will show something very interesting and very profound about the world. So I think I think in terms of influence, probably the greatest influence that I see in terms of how my father dealt with the world is his love of explaining things. Because my father was a very good teacher and loved to teach, and always made things very simple to me. So I remember a time when I said, "Dad, how does optics work? How do lenses work?" And he sat down with me and about 2 hours with a pad of paper, and I had trigonometry. That's important to know. So at the end of this 2-hour thing, I say, "So Dad, it's all about trigonometry." And he said, "That's right." And I said, "So I understand optics." He said, "You now have an undergraduate education in optics." I've forgotten all of it, but at that particular moment, it seemed very clear to me. And my father had this way of being able to explain things very easily and very simply. And I think he probably was inspired by the stories he had heard about Fermi. He never met Fermi, but certainly was inspired.
Well, thank you. This was really great and inspiring. I'd like to open questions to the public, and I'll give the microphone to Giorgio.
When Fermi arrived in the U.S., he had an important role in Manhattan Project. Do you think that when he left Italy, he was aware of the potentiality of the research there?
That's one of the great questions. That's a great question, because Fermi had been doing work in Rome in 1934, 1935, and 1936, where he thought that he was creating elements that were heavier than uranium. Uranium at the time was the heaviest known naturally occurring element. And he thought that he was doing these experiments creating elements that were heavier. Now, it turns out that it wasn't a stupid mistake. It's really hard to figure out what the byproducts of these experiments are. And it took a team of physicists and chemists in Germany 4 extra years or 5 extra years to realize that what Fermi had been doing was splitting the uranium atom. He hadn't been creating heavier elements at all. He had been creating lighter elements because he had been splitting the uranium atom into two much lighter atoms. And Fermi didn't know that until he arrived in the United States, and Bohr, about 2 weeks after Fermi's arrival, came to the United States with the news that the Germans had discovered, doing the exact same experiments that Fermi had done, that Fermi had been splitting the uranium atom. And there's a story behind why Fermi didn't realize that, and it gets fairly technical. But Fermi didn't know about this at the time. Now, what Fermi did know, and what he knew very early on, was that there was energy locked inside the atomic nucleus. And in fact, when he was a kid, he wrote a paper that was published that said the first physicist who unlocks the energy of the nucleus will blow himself up. You know, that poor guy. You know, he could not have imagined, I'm sure, that he was going to be the one to do that. So that's really the history behind, you know, his arrival in the United States and his realization that he had been at this juncture without realizing it. And he realized very quickly what it could mean, and you know, the awesome nature of the work ahead.
Thank you. We have a question back there. All the way back, I think. I saw a hand. Yes. Let's see if we can speak without the microphone. If not, we're going to pass it around.
You had mentioned about Heisenberg, too, and I was curious if you were going to study it.
I'll toss the social aspects of that to David. But other than, you will learn in David's book that when Fermi was, as a young man, went to Germany, he felt very much excluded from the German physicists there who were very much interested in aspects of culture that Fermi was not interested in. But Fermi certainly interacted with Heisenberg at these Michigan summer schools that Fermi found so appealing because he liked the openness of the American society, and talked to Heisenberg on occasion there. I think he deeply respected Heisenberg as a physicist, more so than, for instance, Schrödinger. David?
Picking up on what Bill said, at one of the Ann Arbor summer schools in the summer of 1939, this is after Fermi had arrived, Heisenberg showed up for a week, and Fermi actually spent some time trying to persuade Heisenberg to defect to the United States. He said to Heisenberg, you know, if you go back to Germany, they're going to make you work on the atomic bomb, and you know, it's not going to be a very pleasant experience for you or for the world. Why don't you come here? And he said, you can start all over again, like I did. He said, here you can start with a fresh slate. It's wonderful. It's liberating. And Heisenberg said, no, I'm afraid that's not going to work. I consider myself to be a patriotic German, and I'm going to go back to Germany and do what my country asks me to do. And I think that conversation persuaded Fermi to throw himself, you know, full energy into the Manhattan Project, because he knew that Heisenberg was going to go back and was committed to doing this if the Nazi government wanted him to, and of course the Nazi government did. So after the war, they reestablished contact, and in fact there's a wonderful picture of Fermi and Heisenberg at the conference at Lake Como in 1954, which was Fermi's last trip to Europe, and he died 2.5–3 months later. And there's a wonderful picture of them just sort of enjoying a laugh on the stairs of the villa where the summer school was being held. I think they obviously had a huge amount of respect for each other. But I think there was always in Fermi's mind a little bit of wariness, not only because Heisenberg didn't come over to the United States, but because of this experience that Fermi had as a kid in Göttingen, where he felt neglected.
The gentleman there. Yes.
I'd like to know why Fermi is so unknown, even by the intellectuals in this country, and underappreciated. Supposedly, your book is the first full-fledged biography decided to get rid of. And I was told, oh, Fermi didn't do anything with his cyclotron. He did not accomplish anything when he was at Columbia. There is no reason why we should keep it.
But that's not true. It's really, I mean, it's really interesting you say that, because I believe that there were 2 experiments in January 19th.
Oh, I know that
Yeah.
that's not true.
Yeah.
But
I
still,
think the general
the head of the
perception
Yeah.
of people
Yeah.
is that he was not
at
relevant.
Columbia
It's amazing, isn't it?
that he did absolutely nothing at Columbia.
That's an amazing statement. I think Bill would probably take great issue with that. But let me come back. First of all, just to clarify things, mine is not the first full-fledged biography of Enrico Fermi. There have been a number of others. There was one that was done in 1970 by Emilio Segre, which is a very good biography, but it tends to get fairly technical at times. You know, if you don't have Wikipedia next to you, you're not going to know, and you're not a physicist, you're not going to know what the Zeeman effect is. And the Zeeman effect pops up time and again in that book. I mean, among other things. And there was a book written a year before mine by Emilio Segre's nephew, Gino Segre, and his wife, Bettina Herlin, called The Pope of Physics. I take a somewhat different approach in my book. And I didn't know actually that Gino and Bettina were writing their book when I started working on mine. But I think one of the big problems, it's obviously an issue. Fermi is underappreciated and not as well known as Oppenheimer or Einstein or even today Stephen Hawking or a number of these other, or even, you know, Michio Kaku, okay, who's, you know, but I think part of the answer lies in something that Bill said, which is that some of his contributions are really difficult for a layperson to grasp, although they are central to the agenda of modern physics. The second thing is he wasn't really a media hog. He didn't, you know, he enjoyed being in the limelight with his students and his colleagues. He was not a modest man. He just was, he understood how good he was and enjoyed being as good as he was. But he didn't court the media the way others had. Now, you know, did Oppenheimer court the media? I don't know. I think that Oppenheimer was thrust into the media by virtue of the hearings that, you know, questioned his loyalty. But certainly Einstein courted the media. He was a big media guy, loved the media. And in fact, at a certain point, Fermi used to express resentment about that. You know, he gets all the media attention. You know, the last thing he did was in 1915. And, you know, now it turns out 1915 was a pretty damn big thing. You know, Fermi had an ego, but he didn't court the media. Bill, do you want to? Yeah.
Yes, I think I need to address some aspects of that very interesting question. First of all, regarding Fermi and the public perception, I think even within physics, I don't want to trivialize Fermi, but it's in the sense in which Kleenex or Xerox became a common phrase, part of the vernacular, and we don't attribute it anymore to a particular company, or you know, Xerox, of course, is basically gone. But Fermi is so generic throughout all of physics that even in physics, people do not really appreciate the breadth and depth of his contributions until one stops and thinks about it. And you realize that in the course of a conversation with your colleague, talking back and forth, you're going to say Fermi's name a dozen times. And so, but there isn't a particular course in physics in which you are studying Fermi physics. It's all of the courses in physics. Now, concerning your interactions with the cyclotron in the basement of Pupin Hall at Columbia, well, I'm embarrassed. Yes, it really had zero functionality, and the space was needed. I wasn't chair when that was taking place, but I probably would have done the same thing in the hope that maybe we could take some aspects of the cyclotron and make display in the lobby of the building or something. But to tell you that it's not necessarily unique to Fermi's contributions, the laser was also invented at Columbia, in Pupin Hall, and there's no plaque marking this, and we've almost lost the corporate memory of what floor the laboratory was on where this was invented. So it's being worked on. Contributions are very welcome.
Let's see. Yeah, we have a couple of questions, and we take them maybe together, or you start, and then the lady, and then we'll
I started your book last night. It's fantastic. I
Oh, thank you.
recommend it to everyone. I haven't gotten at all towards the post-war, and I'm wondering, you made 3 preferences in the beginning of the split in the physics community between the people who want to build the super and the people who are opposed. And Fermi's sort of being in one camp and then the other. And I'm wondering, and this seems to be like a very important event.
Yeah, the first thing to know is that Fermi was the person who first had the idea of a hydrogen bomb. Fermi mentioned the idea to Edward Teller, just casually tossing off the idea in a conversation at Columbia in either late 41 or early 42. And of course, it entirely changed Edward Teller's life. And Fermi didn't think probably thought nothing more of it until a little later in the war. And when he thought about it, he thought that it couldn't be done. And in fact, the road that Teller took, which was called the classical super, couldn't be done. And Fermi, in 1949, the question came up to the science advisors of the Atomic Energy Commission: should the United States go ahead and build this? And there was unanimous opposition. There were 9 people on the committee. Oppenheimer chaired it. And there was unanimous opposition. But Fermi and his friend Rabi at Columbia wrote a special paper, a separate paper, arguing that it would be immoral and evil to do so. And then Truman took all those recommendations and threw them out the window and said, we're going to go full speed ahead, based on Edward Teller and I think Ernest Lawrence as well, pressing him to, and Louis Alvarez, pressing to go forward with this idea. Now, it turned out they spent a lot of time and energy on an idea that wasn't going to work. And Fermi then decided, well, if the president decides we're going to go ahead and do this, I need to be inside the tent, not outside the tent. So he spent 2 summers at Los Alamos working on the project, mainly trying to poke holes in the idea that Teller had, and successfully poking holes in the idea that Teller had. And it was only in early 1951 that a mathematician named Stan Ulam and Teller together had an idea, a radically different idea, that made the project possible. But Fermi at that point wasn't involved anymore. And one of the really interesting questions is, having decided that the bomb was evil and shouldn't be built, he then goes ahead and starts working on it. The question is why? And I think part of it was a feeling that because he was first and foremost a physicist, this is an interesting physics problem, and I'd like to sort of see if I can contribute to it. Number 2, I think that it can't work, and my role is going to be to explain why it can't work. And number 3, I think he felt a certain amount of patriotism to the country. This gets back to the exile issue, an exile to a country that welcomed him with open arms and put him at the center of the most secret project of the war as an enemy alien. He was an enemy alien for a period of that time. And so he felt a certain amount of patriotism and felt, well, if the president has decided we're going to go ahead and do this, then it's my patriotic duty to see if it can be done. So.
Last question.
Bill?
Sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Very briefly. So just to be clear, the question about the super refers to a particular form of a thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb, which was thought and is much more powerful, 100 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. So it was a way to enormously increase the power of nuclear weapons. And the appendix that David mentioned, and David can correct me on this if I'm wrong, I think is the only deeply moral statement you will find from Enrico Fermi. And I can remember this more or less word for word. What they wrote said that creating this device it's a necessarily evil thing seen in any light, is the words that they used. So it was really quite striking to see that. It was from Fermi and I. Rabi, a physicist at Columbia and a Nobel Prize winner himself.
Yes, last question.
Yes, I have 3 questions, neither of which is scientific, rather personal. Were Fermi and his wife fluent in English when they came to the U.S.? What did she do? Was she active in anything? And did any of his children follow his steps in science?
Oh, those are 3 great questions. Just great questions. First of all, Fermi was gifted in languages, so he could pick up a language pretty quickly. He knew German fluently by the time he got to the University of Pisa. His way of learning English was he had a stack of Jack London novels, 10 Jack London novels, and an English-Italian dictionary next to him. And he read all those novels, and by the time he finished, he figured he was pretty fluent in English. Well, he got to the United States, and it was fractured English. And in fact, in 1930, when he first came, his English was pretty terrible. And his friends Goudsmit and Uhlenbeck, who were Dutchmen, who were running the summer session, would sit in the back of the room, and afterwards they would correct him on his pronunciation. But there were certain words, and I don't know what those words were, that they never corrected him on because his mispronunciation was so funny that they decided that it would be a tragedy to correct him. Laura had learned English in school and thought that she knew English when she came to the United States in 1930, and really didn't. I mean, she was totally befuddled. But when they got here in '39, they made a real commitment to learning English. And in fact, in the FBI background check that was done on him in 1940, their neighbors, the Uris, Mrs. Uri said that you'll find Italian English dictionaries scattered throughout their house. And it's just very funny. So they took that very seriously. What did Laura do? Well, Laura was a very active and very intellectual person. And she had written a book in Rome about modern physics for the layperson called, I think, The Modern Alchemists or something like that. She had written that with Amaldi's wife, who was a very close friend. And she continued to write later in life. She wrote Adams and the Family, about her life with Enrico. She wrote about a biography about Mussolini. She wrote a book called Illustrious Immigrants. So she was a writer, and in fact, on her tombstone it says Laura Fermi, writer. So she loved it. She was also active in social things. Gun control was one of her favorite subjects. But seriously, I mean, in Chicago at the time, that was a very important thing. And it's important today, too. And what was the third? There was a third. Oh, the children. Nella was not a scientist, but Giulio was. Giulio Judd was a brilliant mathematician, pure mathematician, and spent his career in math, first at the Institute for Defense Analysis in Washington, where he brought mathematical modeling to defense issues. And then he decided he was bored with that and went to work in Cambridge with Max Perutz, who was the molecular biologist. And he did mathematical modeling of proteins. So he was a very, very sophisticated mathematician, and a very gifted one too, but always felt he lived in his father's shadow.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Giorgio, for having us here. And thank you to David Schwartz, and thank you to Bill Zayek.